to Patricia for inviting me.
You're welcome.
And I always look forward to talking about this subject because it's, I think it's something a lot of Tennesseans don't know about. I don't know, I always like making connections with people who were kind of well known outside of Tennessee, and I think it's kind of fun as Tennesseans to be able to claim those people, saying, hey, they got their start here. But a few of you, I was wondering if any of you had heard the name Agee in this part of the country, because it's I think a pretty rare name. I never found many records that showed Agees living here, but I did look at some old census records from 1850 and 1860, and it showed that there was a man at that time, a minister named Alfred Agee, who lived down, it wasn't called Joyner at the time, but it's what's now known as Joyner. He was a minister down there. I don't know if he was associated with the Union Baptist or not.
Probably the Beechport Holiness Church.
Maybe.
Is that because it's been around for longer than Union?
So there was an Alfred Agee, at least at one time. But Alfred had a brother. Alfred was actually from Campbell County, even though he lived, at least for a couple decades or more, he lived in Morgan County. But he was from Campbell County, and he had a brother named James Harris Agee. And James Harris was actually a physician and also a state legislator. He represented Campbell County in Nashville. And one of James Harris's great-grandsons is actually who we're here to talk about. So Alfred Agee, the one who lived in Morgan County, is actually connected to the Agee that I want to talk about a little bit. But so the boy that we're going to talk about today was actually born in Knoxville 110 years ago this November. And so this is actually a very appropriate year to be talking about him. So a little bit about his parents. His mother Laura was from Michigan. Her family came from up north. Her parents were college educated. Now his father, Jay, he's the one who came from Campbell County. Jay was born in 1878, and I was doing a little bit of walking around before I got here to the library and noticed that this old Presbyterian church building right next door to us was built in 1879. So, you know, the year after James Agee's father was born, this church was built. It's a beautiful church. I'm so glad it's still here. But,
you still have church in it?
Yeah, I was amazed to see that.
Yeah.
I knew it must be pretty recent because there was a website listed on the sign out front. So I was like, it must be still in operation, which is great. But anyway, James Agee's father, Jay, again, was from Campbell County. He only finished school through 4th grade. But he educated himself. He loved to read books. And he started teaching somewhere in Campbell County, but eventually he took a little test, civil service exam, and got hired at the post office in Knoxville. And so that's what brought him to Knoxville. Laura Tyler was Agee's mother. She was at UT at the time, and so Jay and Laura met at a little dancing class in Knoxville. Jay Agee started working at the post office around 1901, and by 1904, you know, he and Laura were definitely had met each other and were starting to date. 1904 is the year that the courthouse here in Wartburg was built. So just to give you a little kind of tangible idea of how long ago we're talking. They started courting. They started to talk about getting married, but Jay actually got transferred to Panama, where he worked for the canal project. And in 1906, Laura actually sailed there on a boat, and they got married in Panama. President Theodore Roosevelt actually traveled there in November of that year and visited the little village where they were living. So I don't know if they met each other, but it's very possible. Laura and Jay Agee lived there in Panama for 2 years, and then they returned late that year. And the following November, 1909, James Rufus Agee was born, and that's who I want to talk about today. He grew up, had very soft-hearted little boy. Like to read a little bit of a story that his mother told. One thing that I really liked about researching this is I found an interview, an audio recording, where someone had interviewed Agee's mother, and she died in 1966, and I think this interview was between 1962 and 63, so it was a few years before she died. So it was really neat to hear her voice and everything as she told these, but she talked about a time when her son Rufus, as they called him, went out. They took him out to the woolen mills there in Knoxville, and this is what she said. The women brought their children, and had to have people stay in the nursery all day while they worked in the mills. Rufus said, "Why do they have to stay in such a place? What are they there for?" And my friend explained that their mothers worked and somebody had to take care of them, and that they were very, very poor, which they were. And she said, some of them don't even have shoes and stockings to wear in the winter. And Rufus's eyes commenced to fill up, and he was taking his shoes and stockings off right then and there to give her for whoever would need them. And his mother said, and that was like him too. That continued to be like him. So when he saw people, kids that didn't have the things that he had, he wanted to just give them whatever they needed. There was another story of him finding out the little boy up the street where they lived in Knoxville didn't have a tricycle, and so Rufus actually took his own tricycle and gave it to the boy. And Rufus's parents later found out about it and went and got the tricycle back, because they thought maybe he was a little too generous at times. But I thought those were neat stories. I have a little 2.5-year-old son, and I always, you wonder how they're going to be when they grow up. How sensitive are they going to be to other people's needs? How willing to share is he going to be? Stuff like that. So I enjoyed reading that story. But anyway, he wasn't very physically coordinated. He ran outside and played with the neighborhood kids, but he would have much rather been in a place like this, sitting in a corner with a stack of books next to him. He talked about some of his favorite books growing up. He read things like Robinson Crusoe and King Arthur and his Knights, and Uncle Remus stories, Brer Rabbit, a book called Penrod, which is probably a little bit like Tom Sawyer type of thing. And even he liked project books like The Boy Mechanic. I know, Dad, you had one of those editions of The Boy Mechanic when you were growing up. So, and as an adult, Agee grew up and reviewed books for Time magazine for a time, and so he was very well read. And he said that Moby Dick and Huckleberry Finn were the two greatest works in American literature. So, another thing that I enjoyed learning about little Rufus Agee when he was growing up is how he did in school. I taught at Coalfield School down here for 10 years, and so just seeing children grow up and seeing how they take to learning to a classroom setting, how motivated they are, it made me wonder what he was like when he was in grade school. There's an interesting story that his mother apparently was pretty gung-ho to get him in school, and she actually taught him at home a little bit. He was actually younger than just about everyone in his class when he started kindergarten in the fall of 1914. But he already knew how to read when he started kindergarten. And apparently the school where he was attending there in Knoxville, his teachers were angry over the fact that his mother had taught him to read because she didn't do it their way, I guess. And this is what his mother said in that interview. He said, Rufus already knew how to read, of course, before he got there, and they wished he didn't. It wasn't done according to Hoyle, you know. They said, now don't teach Emma anything. Emma was his little sister, who was 2 years younger. They said, now don't teach Emma anything before she gets to us. Please don't teach her anything, not to read or count or anything. And so Laura was pretty annoyed at that, I think. And Rufus was always jumping ahead and everything. He kind of developed with the neighborhood boys who lived close by, kind of developed a reputation as a teacher's pet a little bit. And so Laura told this other story about a kid who lived just right next door to them, who was in the same grade but was a little bit older and was having a little bit of trouble at school. And so this was a story she told. There was a boy on the other side of us up there on Highland. Highland Avenue was the name of the street in Knoxville where they lived. He was a little older than Rufus, but in the same grade. And Rufus came home one day and said, it was too bad about him. You know, he just can't learn. He just can't learn. And I said, well, that is too bad, but don't think any the less of him for that. If he can't, he can't. But you can. You have been given a good mind, I think, and you're supposed to do all you can with it. And not to look down on anybody who can't, but do the best you can. Well, he got it, and he went and told the child, don't you feel bad because you can't learn? That's all right. I can, but you can't. But that's all right. And the little boy wouldn't play with him anymore for a long time. And so Rufus said to his mother, I don't know why he's mad at me. And I said, well, I do. It's not so mad as it's hurt his feelings. He said, well, I don't see why. I told him it was all right. So he was kind of the smartest kid in the class, but he didn't really know that you're not supposed to tell people that you're smarter than them. And so he wasn't doing it to insult the boy. It's just that he was young and a little bit immature on that. So it's kind of funny, though, to read those stories about him when he was young. But the family lived about 4 or 5 blocks north of UT, up in the neighborhood that's known as Fort Sanders. And it's, most of you know, Fort Sanders was a Civil War fort. There was a battle fought there in November 1863, and it was just a couple blocks west of where Rufus lived. There were actually ruins of the old earthen fort dug into the side of the hill there. And so Rufus actually would walk up there and sort of play in that area. There's not a trace of it anymore. It's between that and Fort Sanders Hospital was built on part of that area, and whole bunch of houses that wiped out any trace of it just about. But anyway, the Agees lived in a big 2-story Victorian house, and with a streetcar running up the middle of the road. And Rufus, as an adult, actually wrote a piece called Knoxville Summer of 1915. It's a very famous work, probably the most famous thing ever written about Knoxville. And it actually begins this, he published the piece in 1938 in a magazine, but it was later printed as the introduction to his novel. And I'll talk about his novel a little bit later, but this is a little picture of the kind of slower paced life that some of our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents would have recognized, even out here in Morgan County. So he wrote, "We are talking now of summer evenings in Knoxville, Tennessee, in the time that I lived there so successfully disguised myself as a child. It was a little bit mixed sort of block, fairly solidly lower middle class with one or two juts apiece on either side of that. The houses corresponded, middle-sized, gracefully fretted wood houses built in the late 90s and early 1900s, with small front and side and more spacious backyards, and trees in the yards and porches. These were soft-wooded trees, poplars, tulip trees, cottonwoods. There were fences around one or two of the houses, but mainly the yards ran into each other, with only now and then a low hedge that wasn't doing very well. There were few good friends among the grown people, and they were not poor enough for the other sort of intimate acquaintance, but everyone nodded and spoke, and even might talk short times, trivially, and at the two extremes of the general or the particular, and ordinarily next-door neighbors talked quite a bit when they happened to run into each other, and never paid calls. The men were mostly small businessmen, one or two very modestly executives, one or two worked with their hands, most of them clerical, and most of them between 30 and 45. But it is of these evenings I speak. Supper was at 6 and was over by 1:30. There was still daylight, shining softly and with a tarnish like the lining of a shell, and the carbon lamps lifted at the corners were on in the light, and the locusts were started. He used the word locusts. We would say cicadas now. That's what he's talking about here. And the locusts were started, and the fireflies were out, and a few frogs were flopping in the dewy grass by the time the fathers and the children came out. The children ran out first, hell-bent and yelling those names by which they were known. Then the fathers sank out leisurely in crossed suspenders, their collars removed and their necks looking tall and shy. The mothers stayed back in the kitchen, washing and drying, putting things away, recrossing their traceless footsteps like the lifetime journeys of bees. When they came out, they had taken off their aprons, and their skirts were dampened, and they sat in rockers on their porches quietly. And he talks about the fathers, all the fathers in the neighborhood pulling out the garden hoses and watering the front lawns. And Agee was really into music, even from a young age. And he describes the sounds of the water spraying from the hose almost as if it's an instrument. And then he describes the sound of the cicadas as we know them. And it's just a really, it's almost like when he's thinking back to his childhood, time sort of stood still in his mind. And he wrote about all these things. But then he goes and talks about after a while his family would walk back to the backyard and lay down a quilt in the backyard and just sit out there and talk. And Rufus remembered sitting there, and his parents would be there, and his aunt and uncle, and he would be hearing them talk, and he couldn't really understand all of the stuff they were talking about, but he just remembered it as a really beautiful time in his childhood. And so he wrote, "On the rough, wet grass of the backyard, my father and mother have spread quilts. We all lie there, my mother, my father, my uncle, my aunt, and I too am lying there. First we were sitting up, then one of us lay down, and then we all lay down, on our stomachs, or on our sides, or on our backs, and they have kept on talking. They're not talking much, and the talk is quiet, of nothing in particular, of nothing at all in particular, of nothing at all. The stars are wide and alive. They seem each like a smile of great sweetness, and they seem very near. All my people are larger bodies than mine, quiet, with voices gentle and meaningless, like the voices of sleeping birds." And then he says, "By some chance here they are, all on this earth, and who shall ever tell the sorrow of being on this earth, lying on quilts on the grass in a summer evening among the sounds of the night? May God bless my people, my uncle, my aunt, my mother, my good father. Oh, remember them kindly in their time of trouble and in the hour of their taking away. After a little while I am taken in and put to bed. Sleep, soft smiling, draws me unto her, and those receive me who quietly treat me as one familiar and well beloved in that home, but will not, oh will not now, not ever, but will not ever tell me who I am." So that's one of the most beautiful things I've ever read I think, and it's even people who have never been to Knoxville, you know, people all over the world read that piece that he wrote. It was actually later turned into a piece of music by a man named Samuel Barber. He used part of that piece and had a soprano, you know, a female voice singing it along with an orchestra, and a lot of people know it from that piece too. And there's actually people that have come all the way to Knoxville from across the world, you know, trying to find that place that Agee described, because it was such a beautiful description there. But it turns out that summer of 1915 was kind of one of the last times that that Agee had to make these kind of positive memories, peaceful memories, joyful memories, because it was the last summer that he had both of his parents living. So in 1916, May 1916, Jay's father, or Agee's father, Jay, gets a call in the middle of the night from up in Campbell County, where his parents live. So this would be Rufus's grandparents. They live in Jacksboro, up at the family farm there. And so Rufus's grandfather has a stroke one night. And so they call down to Knoxville. Jay answers the phone, and Jay's brother up in Jacksboro is asking him to come up, that it's not looking good for their father. And, you know, so it's a long drive, but Jay feels like he needs to go up there. So he goes out. He has a Model T, a 1915 Model T Ford, and so he goes out and cranks it, and he actually drives out Clinton Pike. You know, Clinton Highway now comes off the 275 and goes up through Powell, you know, by crosses Merchants and goes up there and goes up toward where the Walmart is, and then goes up over the hill down and goes all the way up to Campbell County. And so that's basically the road. It's the road back then that was known as Clinton Pike. It didn't follow exactly that route because it actually started a little bit west of there. Like if you go out Western Avenue from downtown Knoxville and you turn up Pleasant Ridge Road, that's sort of the old Clinton Pike. But anyway, so it was a long journey though. It took about 3 hours one way back then, because, you know, Model Ts, they were only going maybe 20, 30, maybe if you're going downhill 40 or 45, something like that, on a smooth road. So it took a while, and, you know, you can kind of imagine Jay kind of weighing it in his mind, like, okay, how serious is this news that I'm getting? Is my brother exaggerating things, or is our dad really doing that bad? So he chooses to go up there and see how his dad's doing. He gets up there early on the morning of May 18th, 1916. Apparently his dad is doing poorly enough that he decides to spend part of the day up there and then come home, maybe after eating dinner, get his wife and kids and take them back up there. Was apparently his plan. And he does that, leaves maybe around 5 p.m. on May 18th, heading back from Jacksboro toward Knoxville on those windy gravel roads. But on the way, he's about 10 miles from home when something goes wrong. I don't know if you all are familiar much with Powell or Clinton Highway, where Emory Road meets Clinton Highway. That's about where he was when he went over this little bridge across Beaver Creek, and when he got to the south side of the riverbank, or the creek bank, something caused his car to turn toward the side of the road, and there was a little bit of an embankment up there, and he lost control of the car, and it went up the embankment and turned over, and as it was turning over, it threw him out, and it landed on top of him.
Oh, wow.
So there was no one in the car with him. There was no one there to see what happened. They just showed up. People showed up afterwards and looked at the tire tracks and looked at the road conditions and decided that he was probably driving too fast. You know, maybe there was something like a stone in the road that he hit. I actually got a chance when I was researching this to sit in a Model T. It was actually a 1916 model, but the guy who owned it lived out in Maryville, and he said, I want to show you something. Sit up there in the driver's seat. So I sat there, and it's such a narrow car, you know, and it had this little steering wheel. Right in the middle of the steering wheel was this big bolt, right in the center. And he said, okay, hold on to the wheel. And he said, grip it as tight as you can. And what he did, he went up to the front of the car and kind of crouched down, and he shoved against the front wheel, the front tire, and it totally jerked the steering wheel out of my hands. So if Jay Agee had been driving and maybe hit a rock in the road, it could have knocked the steering wheel totally out of his hands, realistically. And so it wouldn't have taken long at all to lose control over that. Another thing that kind of may have contributed to it, he could have been tired. You know, it's likely he didn't get much sleep, if any sleep, the night before. Another thing is it was very dark. The wreck was around 8 p.m., which doesn't seem very late or dark in the summertime, but there was actually a 2-hour difference. Like, it was 2 hours darker than it is now, and one of the reasons they didn't have daylight saving time. And also Knoxville was in Central Time instead of Eastern Time at that time. So it was at 8 p.m. it would be like 10 p.m. now. So it was very dark. Model Ts didn't have very bright headlights. I read a quote from one Model T owner. He said it was like the headlights were like 2 jars of lightning bugs, as far as how bright they were. So anyway, it was a big shock. The family found out. Someone who had arrived at the scene actually made a call, and somehow Agee's family found out about the crash. There was actually a man who was asked there at the scene on Clinton Pike. I don't know how he showed up there, but they asked him to drive the car back to Knoxville, because it actually was owned by the factory where Agee's father worked. There was a little factory there on White Avenue, close to World's Fair Park, in downtown Knoxville, and it was they manufactured some marble cutting machinery, stuff like that. But that's where Jay worked, and the car was kind of given to him by, or at least leased to him by his father-in-law. Laura's father co-owned the place. But anyway, so this man was asked to drive the dead man's car back to the factory and drop it off. And when he got there, he asked the owner of the company if he could have the dead man's job.
Wow.
Which took a lot of guts, I would say. But maybe not too diplomatic, I don't know. But anyway, he got the job, surprisingly, and ended up becoming a partner in the company. And in 1950, he actually became the owner of the company. He purchased it. So it's just kind of strange how this accident, it affected many families. But if you just look at this man who got that job that night, right after the accident, Jay Agee's death kind of opened up a whole new opportunity for his family. In the same way, a lot of people have talked about Rufus Agee. What would his life have been like if his dad hadn't died? Well, it turns out that, you know, if Jay hadn't died, his son wouldn't have gone down to boarding school in Sewanee, down in Middle Tennessee. Down there, Rufus met this priest. In fact, this book right here is called The Letters of James Agee to Father Fly. Letters go all the way from like 1926 to 1955. He carried on this friendship with this priest and teacher that he met down at this boarding school in Sewanee. So he wouldn't have met that man if his dad hadn't died. His mother, a few years later, remarried a man named Erskine Wright, and he was also in kind of a clergyman, but he was apparently well-to-do enough that he sent Rufus off to New England to attend school at this prestigious New England prep school, and then Rufus went on to attend Harvard University. So there's a lot of things about the wreck that, even though it was tragic, it kind of opened doors and kind of steered Rufus out of Knoxville and somehow into professional writing. Because after he left Harvard, he started working for Fortune magazine. Fortune, it's still around, and Fortune actually assigned him some articles on TVA that brought him back to Knoxville for research. In 1936, he went down. Fortune assigned him to write about these cotton farmers in Alabama, and it resulted, he actually went down and for a few weeks stayed with this family, very, very poor as you can imagine, a family who was basically, as sharecroppers, they're borrowing everything they own, from their house to their farm tools to the seed that they get, and paying most of it back to the landowner. And so they're living just hand to mouth all the time, never able to save anything really, and especially if you have a bad year of crops. But anyway, this Agee ended up writing an article for Fortune that they rejected. They're like, this is too long and it's not what we're looking for. We're not looking for, a piece of social criticism. They just wanted to know like the economics, I guess, of the cotton farming. But this book was actually published in 2013. It was Agee's original article that he wrote for Fortune magazine that they rejected. And so it has a lot of photographs by Walker Evans, who actually went down there with him to Alabama. And there's some really beautiful photographs, some famous ones. I'm trying to find one of the more famous photographs of the mother of the family that they stayed with. So these two are some of the most famous photographs, and they kind of came to represent the Depression to a lot of people when they saw these photographs. But anyway, Rufus stayed with that family and wrote about it. After Fortune rejected that version, he 3 years later published Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, which is probably 5 times as long at least, because he kept rewriting it and rewriting it. But anyway, it was published in 1941. People at the time weren't interested in it. It only sold about 600 copies because that was the same year that World War II started. People didn't care about the Depression at that point. They were thinking about the war. It is a challenge, but it's a very famous work. It's very poetic in some ways. He goes into great detail about those people's lives. In fact, I've since read some things about like the children of the people that he wrote about, the grandchildren, who there's still hard feelings, because when this book came out, and they, I think one of the later editions, like these people were on the cover,
Yeah.
and so people in the area he wrote about knew those people, and he writes some pretty frank things about them. Like they found out from reading the book that while they had been out in the fields picking cotton, James Agee had been inside the house basically prowling around through their clothes and writing about their underwear and writing about every single thing in their house. And they felt like that he was basically profiting, making money off telling what pitiful, ragged people they were. But he was doing it basically to show what the conditions were really like. And he wasn't writing. In fact, a lot of the book, at the introduction, he's kind of going back and forth in his head about, okay, I don't know if what I'm doing is right by printing this. He wrote something in there about, I wish instead of me writing about this that we just had a scrapbook with things pasted that people can touch to really know what these people's lives were like. So he kind of downgraded his own work on this, but there's been more written about this book than there has about A Death of the Family. Like people all over the world know this.
So he wasn't trying to put the people down, he was just trying to inform people.
Well, another thing is, unlike traditional journalism where the journalist, the reporter, isn't supposed to really inject themselves into the story. They're just supposed to keep it straight to the facts. Like half the book is him telling about what he thinks and what he experienced himself. And that even includes things about him having thoughts about some of the girls that probably were a little bit scandalous, and so, when that came out, there were some hard feelings from those surviving family members, but it became actually very popular during the Civil Rights era when people from the North were going down to try to help black voters register to vote. And they actually read this, even though the families Agee wrote about were white, they read it because of kind of the social justice angle of it, trying to understand the mindset of people from the South. So it became very popular again in the 60s when it was republished, and hasn't been out of print. A lot of college classes assign that as their textbooks for it. So it's a very, very well-known work, even if it's a struggle to get through sometimes. So also in the 40s, he began reviewing books for Time magazine, and then began reviewing films, movies, for Time magazine and The Nation. And a lot of people consider his style of writing as kind of the beginning of modern film reviewing, film criticism. And actually he stopped reviewing films for Time and The Nation in 1948, which is apparently the year that Wartburg's first library opened, according to what Patricia said. So just to give you an idea of what was happening here locally while Agee was off in New York during his writing career. So after that, he kind of, through his film writing, he actually started some friendships with some Hollywood people who appreciated what he was writing about films. So Charlie Chaplin, he started a friendship. Apparently they actually were kind of working on a script together that never went anywhere, but they really respected each other. Another one was John Huston, who ended up hiring Agee to write the screenplay for The African Queen, which received an Academy Award nomination. So Agee had his hand in everything. Even when he was at Harvard and earlier, he was writing a lot of poetry. He won a major poets competition through Yale University and got his work published. He also, around the time that Wartburg's first library got started, he was in the middle of writing a novel based on his childhood. Now his father's death kind of haunted him. You see in a lot of his early stories from when he was at Phillips Exeter and even Harvard, he was writing things about a family member that had died. Sometimes he would write humorous things, but sometimes they were very serious, like how the family copes with life after this family member has died. So he wrote a lot about it. And apparently he worked on this novel for decades, just thinking about it, really wanting to represent his own thoughts as a little boy, but also the points of view of his mother and sister and aunt and uncle and grandparents who were also very much affected by the death. So he also wrote, one thing that I was going to say is, I don't know for sure that, I don't have any evidence that Agee ever came to Morgan County. But when we look at the hills out here, in a way, the Cumberland Plateau, the Cumberland Mountains were kind of, he was very much connected to those mountains because I think it's about, 27, probably more than that, 30-something miles to the north, what would that be? Northeast, you get to Campbell County, Jacksboro area. His grandparents' farm was right at the foot of Cumberland Mountain. If you go 100 miles in the other direction, toward the southwest, you get to Sewanee, basically, in Franklin County. And that's where he was at the boarding school down there, exploring, walking through the woods and everything. He ended up writing a little short novel, a novella, called The Morning Watch, which was came out in 1950, published, and it's all about his experience, kind of religious transformation at that school during this kind of ceremony called the Morning Watch, which is meant to kind of, it's an Episcopal boarding school, kind of Anglo-Catholic. And the Morning Watch was a ceremony where people stay up all night, they take different shifts of prayer, and it's meant to kind of bring to mind the disciples who were supposed to be in the Garden of Gethsemane praying with Christ that night that he was in prayer before he was crucified. And so that he writes about that. He writes about kind of the thoughts of an adolescent boy trying to stay focused in prayer and kind of beating himself up for his thoughts straying toward other things. And if you've ever had a time in your life when you were seeking to, or you were trying to please God through your own actions and power and feeling very defeated, this book is a good representation of that, because he's trying in his own power to kind of be this devout boy who's trying to serve and failing at every turn. And it's a very serious work. Probably very much based on fact. It's like the one about his father's death. It is fictionalized, so it's not a diary, or it's not a memoir, but it's very much based on his life. Like I said, he published that. He was working on this all the way up till his death. He wrote some other film scripts toward the end of his life, but he didn't take very good care of himself. He was an alcoholic. He, chain smoked pretty much. He womanized. He was married like 3 times. You never know. You only know what you read in the biographies, but you get the idea that he wasn't very close to his children, except for times when he chose to be, because he was very dedicated to his writing, almost above all else. So he didn't take good care of himself. Toward the end of his life, people talked about the fact that he just didn't take care of himself, and he suffered heart attacks. And so basically, after years of heart trouble, he died in New York. One morning he got up, called for a taxi because he had a doctor's appointment apparently to go to, and on the way there he dies in the back seat, or at least has a major heart attack, and died at the hospital probably. And he was only 45. So he died on May 16th, 1955. But he had lived in Tennessee for almost a third of those years, even though the last 2/3 of his life he lived in New York mainly, and even Hollywood for a short time while he was working on films. So he had lost contact with most of his Tennessee relatives, but even then, he still thought that Tennessee was one of the few places where he really felt at home. He left behind a lot of unpublished work, including this novel, which he'd been working on for decades. So just to give you an idea of how he was remembered when he died, this is actually the article that the News Sentinel published 2 days after he died. It just happens to have been published on May 18th, 1955. May 18th was the same day his father died. So they died within 2 days of each other, which is very odd too. So this is what the local article said. It said, James Agee, Knoxville-born poet, critic, magazine, and screenwriter, died yesterday. They really, I guess this was written on the 17th, but not printed until the 18th. Died yesterday of a heart attack in a New York taxi cab. He was 45. Mr. Agee suffered a serious heart attack while working in California about 2 years ago and had to return to New York only fairly recently. And Mr. Agee had been on his way to see his doctor for a final checkup on his heart condition at the time he suffered the fatal heart attack. He was rushed to a hospital by the taxi driver. Mr. Agee published a book of poetry, Permit Me Voyage, 2 years after graduating from Harvard. He published a novel, The Morning Watch, in 1951. He was on the editorial staff of Fortune magazine from 1932 to 1935, and on the staff of Time magazine from 1939 to 1948. One of his editors there at Time called him the finest writer Time ever had. One of his earlier poems, Knoxville Summer of 1915, has been set to music and has been played here by the Knoxville Symphony Orchestra and has been performed nationally. That piece by Samuel Barber actually premiered in 1948, so the same year that Wartburg's library first got started. Mr. Agee wrote film criticism for Nation, Partisan Review, Harper's, and The Forum. He wrote movie script for The African Queen. He leaves his wife Mia and 3 children. He actually had a son with a different wife as well. Mr. Agee was the son of the late James Agee and Mrs. Laura Tyler Agee. Mr. Agee Sr., in other words, J. Agee, his father, a native of Campbell County who came to Knoxville as a young man, was killed 39 years ago today in an automobile accident as he was returning from a visit with relatives in Campbell County. A few years after her husband's death, his mother was married to Father Erskine Wright, member of an Episcopal order and a teacher at St. Andrews at Sewanee. Father Wright died about 5 years ago. And it talks a little bit more about his family members that lived there in Knoxville. I noticed, though, that as I was reading this, there was, on one side of the article, there was another article about a man who had been arrested for drunk driving on Clinton Highway, the same road that his father died on. And then right underneath it, there's an ad for special type of laxative now prescribed by doctors for hemorrhoid sufferers. So people trying to read and remember James Agee had to look past those other things. So Agee died in 1955. We were talking about the Coalfield Library. That actually opened in 1956. So that was the year after Agee died. And then in 1957, November, is when a friend of Agee's, David McDowell, edited together Agee's final manuscript on that novel and published this, A Death in the Family. And the following May, 1958, it won the Pulitzer Prize in fiction. Let's see, around 1960, it was turned into a Broadway play. It was adapted for a Broadway play by Tad Moselle and called All the Way Home. And it ran on Broadway, and the Broadway play won a Pulitzer Prize in 1961. The only other time that a source novel and its adaptation both won the Pulitzer. A few years earlier, James Michener's Tales of the South Pacific had won the Pulitzer, and then Rodgers and Hammerstein's musical South Pacific also won a Pulitzer. So it hadn't happened very much. I don't think it's happened much since then either. It was also turned into a movie by Paramount Pictures. Robert Preston, who was in The Music Man, and Gene Simmons, not the guitar player of Kiss, but Gene Simmons, the actress, Jean Simmons. They played Agee's parents. And it's funny because Robert Preston had actually acted in a movie with Agee called The Bride Comes to Yellow Sky a few years before Agee died. But anyway, that movie was shot, it was filmed in Knoxville in the Fort Sanders neighborhood. Came out in 1963. But it's just interesting. I always liked, and one thing in the book that I dug into is how Knoxville remembered Agee. You know, they had the premiere of All the Way Home there at the Tennessee Theater. Since then, they also dedicated a recording studio, actually over there where West High School is. They have a James Agee gymnasium over there. It was originally built as a film recording studio. I don't think they ever made any films there, but eventually the city had some conferences about Agee. They dedicated a park, James Agee Park, in 2005. One of the streets up there that goes past where Agee's house was, they renamed James Agee Street. Unfortunately, the house was torn down in 1962. Literally 1 month before Hollywood came there to film All the Way Home in his neighborhood. It's kind of frustrating to think of that. But so anyway, he's been celebrated a lot. Pellissippi State Community College now, like 3 years ago, started the James Agee Conference for Literature and Arts. Every fall they have a little literary conference there named after Agee. But like I said, the novel is, I think, I wouldn't say it will be your favorite book, because some people don't like that there's not as much plot. I mean, it's basically about a father dying. You know, the title kind of gives it away, and how the family deals with it just in a few days between the death and the burial. So it's a very simple book, but it's very beautifully written. I always tell people, you know, I'm happy for people to check out my book, but I'd rather them start with this, because as Tennesseans, I think, knowing that we had a Pulitzer Prize-winning author being born not far from Morgan County, and writing such a beautiful book, I think it's worth checking out. But I have a lot of books sitting up here, just ones I've collected during my research. There's a previous biography that came out on his life, was published in the mid-'80s. This one right here is actually a restored version of this. UT professor named Michael Alfaro did a lot of research uncovering a lot of Agee's manuscripts that had never been published, and found Agee's notes and outlines, and basically published this, saying that this is actually pretty much as close as we'll get to Agee's intention for his novel, that this one was changed a lot by the editor that took control over it after Agee died. They're very different. Everything that's in here is in this one somewhere in the book, but this is chronological, and it doesn't start with Knoxville Summer of 19, which is a very beautiful piece. It actually starts with a nightmare Agee had of pretty much carrying his father's dead body through the streets of Knoxville, rescuing it from a crowd of people. and trying to find a place to bury it, basically. But that sort of nightmare that wakes him up causes him to go back and think about, what are the kinds of things I wish I could say to my father that I never got to say. And he writes that, as I'm thinking about my own life and trying to recover parts of my life that I lost, I realized that I'd be writing a lot about my father, because he really looked up to his father, even if he was a little bit afraid of him sometimes. But anyway, that's UT Press is in the middle of like a 12-volume set of Agee's work. A lot of it, half of it has never been published before, at least. So this is a complete book on all of Agee's journalism for Fortune, for Time, stuff like that. Again, this is letters of James Agee to Father Fly. This is another kind of biography that contains a lot of quotes from people who knew Agee. And but anyway, I wanted to see, does anyone have any questions about James Agee that you thought, or something about his life that I've said that didn't make sense, or you had confusion about, or something?
He had an extraordinary life.
Yeah.
I can really think about everything.
Yeah. Just to think about, this little boy in Knoxville, kind of teacher's pet, kind of bragging about how much he knows, but then, where he went, how much he accomplished, and in so many different genres of writing: poetry, journalism, film criticism, novels, screenplays. It's pretty amazing. He's not considered a major writer by some, I think, because even though he wrote a ton of stuff, a lot of it was out of print when he died, or is still unpublished. So it's still going to be a while before we really understand how much he really did write. But he's not as popular as like William Faulkner or other Southern writers.
Do you know, or have you said, and maybe I've just forgotten, did any of his own children write anything about him that you know of?
His daughter Dee Dee, who died in 2016, I believe. She wrote a little bit about her memories. His children didn't seem to have many memories of him, but she's one of his children who did write. She wrote a little kind of memoir or essay about some things and growing up with the name Agee, and kind of people knew of her father and kind of feeling like, should I keep this name? Should I hide it, or should I be proud of it? So she wrote a little bit, and then his son from a different marriage, Joel Agee, he again was very small, didn't have many memories of actually meeting his father because his parents split up not long after he was born. But he wrote a little bit about his father in a memoir that he wrote. So so there is a little bit of things published by his children.
So about how many years of research did you do before you wrote the book?
I would say it was probably around 2012, 2013 when I really started, and what got me interested was reading this. I was like you, Patricia, when I first saw the name Agee, I'd never really seen it, didn't know how it was pronounced. I thought it was maybe pronounced Agee or something, Agee. But anyway, there's a writer in Knoxville, historian named Jack Neely. He used to write for a paper called the Metro Pulse. And he wrote about this event that they used to have every May 18th at this little bar in Powell, not far from where the crash happened, they say. And they would read stories and different things and have music. But hearing about that crash and that a novel was written about it, it made me want to read this. The fact that it happened, you know, I used to travel up and down Clinton Highway a lot, going between Clinton and Knoxville, and it turns out that's pretty much the route that his father took on his last trip home. And so I read this and fell in love with it, and I mainly started researching just as a hobby because I wanted to know more about the people that are in this book, find out how close it was to the actual events, and so that kind of led me. I started just researching as a hobby, and then I'd say between 2012, 2013, and 2016 is when I kind of completed the first drafts of the book. So it was several years there, working off and on it. So, but again, I would never say that, you know, if you pick up this book, it will become your favorite book, or Agee will become your favorite author. But I do think that Tennesseans, especially East Tennesseans, living so close to where he grew up, I think it would be good to give it a chance. And what I fell in love with about it is just that he describes, you know, Gay Street, downtown Knoxville. He names these places that you can actually go walk the same streets that he walked. Highland Avenue is still there. In fact, I found out, well, for another thing that got me interested is that my birthday is May 18th.
Oh,
And so when I found out that this whole book is based on a tragedy that happened on a May 18th, that's another reason why.
Rob's birthday is May the 18th.
Oh, really? I also realized that
Mine's May the 12th. So
Oh, it is.
something going
Yeah.
on in May here.
For sure. And again, Agee himself died on May 16th.
16th, yeah.
He grew up on, I didn't find out till after, he grew up on the same block of Highland Avenue where my wife and I go to church.
Oh, wow.
Unfortunately, the house isn't there, but you know, it just really brought it to life for me when I could visualize these places he wrote about.